the heck is a ninja sword, and do they actually exist? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. So over the years I've been asked many times to talk about ninja swords. What are ninja swords? Are they in fact a real thing? Did they exist historically? Do they even exist now? The confusion around this topic has been increased, unfortunately, in recent years because certain things are being marketed or sold as ninja swords which don't have any correlation to even the supposed historical basis for ninja swords. So a lot of the things you will find online labelled as ninja swords aren't in fact ninja swords. So what are ninja swords? Very briefly, if you've arrived on this video not having seen my channel before, who am I? What am I? I'm an antique arms dealer. I've worked at auction houses as head of arms and armour. I work with TV and movie companies. I also work with museums on the development of replicas. I am a fencing instructor and I also do reenactment and things like that as well. And I also help out the government. I am a former civil servant myself and I sometimes consult for the police also. Now first up, before I get into talking about actual historical ninja swords and whether they existed or not, I want to be absolutely categorically clear that a lot of what are being called ninja swords on the internet currently essentially fall under what is known in the UK legally and in the media as a zombie knife or zombie sword. Or zombie machete. They aren't in any way, shape or form related to traditional Japanese weapons. So a lot of the things which are out there being called ninja swords have absolutely nothing to do with ninja, nothing to do with Japanese history, and nothing much like ninja swords that I'm going to be talking about in this video. And today's wonderful sponsors for this channel and this video are HelloFresh. HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit. Every subscription helps this channel, which means that hopefully I can keep making this awesome content for you. So they say that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. I happen to agree, and so does HelloFresh. That's why they're giving all subscribers free breakfast for life. Now, if you like cooking and enjoying eating yummy food, but are bored of thinking up new recipes, HelloFresh is here to help. HelloFresh brings you over 30 calorie smart and protein smart recipes every week. With fresh ingredients, everything's measured out to the correct proportions for the recipes, and it's delicious. And with summer fading behind us, everyone's looking to save some time and money. Each box is fully customizable, so you can cater it to your specific demands and wants. Now, I don't know about you, but when I have the ingredients ready to cook, it makes it much more likely that I'm actually going to make a proper meal. So if you want to save some time and some money, but also eat yummy, healthy food that's catered for you and you can customize, HelloFresh is for you. Check out the link in the description down below or scan my QR code on screen and use my special code SCHOLASEP10 and you'll receive 10 free meals and breakfast for life. That's one free breakfast item per box while the subscription's active in the US. The link and code are valid in all countries and the respective local discounts will apply. Thanks for sticking with me. Now let's get back to the main topic of this video, which is what are ninja swords? Now you may notice that I am holding an antique Japanese sword here. This is from the 19th century, this particular one, and this, so Edo period, and this is what's known as a wakizashi. Okay, so that is a medium size, I won't say short, it's a medium sized Japanese sword. Now Japanese swords in the age of the ninja, at least archaeologically and in terms of the antique world, split into, let's say, 4 main types. Okay, so essentially you have the tachi, which is, I've got one here, so the tachi is a long sword, and this was worn both on horseback and on foot, in fact, but a lot of books will tell you that it was developed for horseback fighting, which isn't really correct, but it's essentially one of the longer forms of Japanese sword. There are bigger ones like odachi and things like that, which we won't get into here, but the tachi was the main samurai's sword all the way through to the 15th century. When we get into the 15th century, there was a transitional period. Tachi do stay around later. They stay all the way through to the Edo 19th century as well, late Edo period. But in the late 15th century, a particular type of sword, which is now very famous, known as the katana to the modern world, but perhaps more correctly known as the uchigatana, which is essentially a sword that you wear edge up. You wear it somewhat differently, and it has slightly different proportions. Won't go into the details here because that's outside the scope of this video. So that is the katana, or uchigatana, is is the long sword according to most people. So that becomes the samurai's main sword. Now the backup sword, or the secondary sword, sometimes used in the left hand at the same time as the katana, if you're studying musashi, for example, is the shorter one, which is the wakizashi. So the typical samurai sword is, if that's the katana, the shorter one, which is also a samurai sword, and this is the one that would be worn indoors, for example, if you take the long sword out of your sash, or indeed this would be worn sometimes by people like spearmen or musketeers rather than the longer sword. That's the wakizashi. There is also the tanto, which is essentially a shorter version of the wakizashi. Sometimes has a straight blade, sometimes has different shaped cross sections and tips. But essentially they're the four main types of sword. Now, an important point to make about the ninja is, or shinobi if you want to call them that, is that they were essentially assassins, spies, information, reconnaissance gatherers, this kind of thing. Okay, so they were sort of a cross between scouts and sort of counterintelligence and infiltration, this type of thing, supposedly. And there are some people who challenge all of the assumptions and assumed knowledge we have about the ninja. But again, that's outside the scope of this video. But the main point to make here is that ninja, when they existed, didn't necessarily go around wearing a sword. Okay, if your primary job is to be a spy or to be a scout, very often you will just use a weapon that might be to hand, or you might, if you are scouting in a military sense, you might just carry whatever weapon a normal person might carry, for example a wakizashi or a tanto, or even a spear in some cases, or a bow. So you will use normal weapons. There aren't special designated weapons, although there are some exceptions, and there are famous things like foot claws and throwing stars, shuriken and things like this. So there are some specialized weapons like that, but there isn't really any historical evidence for historical ninja or shinobi using special types of sword. Okay, so that's the headline, is that by and large, from what we know about them using swords, they used the typical standard Japanese swords, the wakizashi, the katana, the tanto, and things like that. They didn't have a specific regulation model for ninjas of the wakizashi, for example. But despite all this, there is a type of sword known as the ninja to, if you want to look online for these sorts of things, or sometimes shinobi katana, which is a distinctive looking sword that looks somewhat different to a typical wakizashi, which is sold as a ninja sword and is used by certain martial arts schools that practice ninjitsu, which is sometimes a subset of Bujinkan. Or Budo. And so the characteristic features of that are, it is usually about the size and proportions of a wakizashi. It's not as long as a katana. Sometimes it's even shorter, in fact, than a typical wakizashi. It has a long grip like a wakizashi. But here are the characteristic features. It usually has a straight blade instead of a curved blade. Now, most Japanese swords, I'll come back to this point in more detail in a second, most Japanese swords have slightly curved blades. Some of them are more curved, and in fact, some of them are straight, but we'll come to that in a second. But the characteristic feature of the ninja to or ninja sword is that it's essentially like a wakizashi with a straight blade. And there's one other feature which is very common, although not universal, very common to modern, shall we say, replica ninja to, and that is a straight or rectangular tsuba. Now the tsuba is the handguard here. Now most handguards on katana, wakizashi, tachi, so on and so forth, are either round, oval, or they can be rectangular, they can be square. So most of them, however, are round or oval, or kind of a figure eight shape. And we'll maybe do a dedicated video talking about tsuba or handguards in the future. But one of the characteristic features, apart from the straight blade, of the ninja to or ninja sword is that it has a straight guard. And there are some people that make up reasons for this. It's about leaning against a wall so you can climb up and things like this. I think, frankly, this is all made up rubbish. And we do in fact find square tsuba on normal katana, on tachi and wakizashi sometimes. It is a shape of tsuba you do find. But for some reason in the modern world, the ninja to, the ninja sword, has to have a straight blade and a square guard. So where on earth did this a modern idea of a ninja sword or ninja toe come from? Frankly, we don't know. So some of the practitioners of ninjutsu claim that it is a genuine thing that goes back at least to the Edo period, probably earlier. However, there's no evidence for it. So as an antique dealer, as a former archaeologist and as a historian and a researcher of arms and armour, here is the elephant in the room. There's no evidence, there is no evidence of these ninja toe or ninja swords from before. The earliest I found is 1956, okay? So post Second World War, 1956. And in fact, that comes from a booklet that was published called Ninjutsu, which shows a picture of a wakizashi type sword, which is straight. And this is the first evidence that we have. Now, it's possible that it goes back a little bit further than that, but fundamentally this is 20th century. There is no evidence before the 20th century, in fact no hard evidence before 1956 of the existence of anything like a ninja toe, okay? After that, we get the foundation of the Ninja Museum, and we get a whole bunch of movies and things like this published in the 1960s and 1970s, such that throughout the 60s it starts to become established that ninjas used a special type of sword that was straight with a square guard. And this becomes so established, and there were examples made, modern-made examples made for the Ninja Museum. This becomes so established that Black Belt magazine in 1973 starts selling replica ninja swords, and that's what they look like. They are straight bladed, relatively short, with a square guard. So this seems to have come about in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and was very closely linked with theatre and cinema. Okay, so the spread of the popularity and idea of ninjas seems to have gone hand in hand with the idea of a ninja sword. You know, King Arthur has Excalibur, you know, the musketeers have got their rapiers, and the ninja must have a ninja sword. They couldn't just be seen to be using a standard wakizashi like anybody else in Japan. They have to have a characteristic hero sword or villain sword, depending on the story. So there we go. The foundation of the ninja toe seems to really be a product of the middle of the 20th century and very closely linked to theatre and movie industry, and has been so ever since, and was promoted by martial arts equipment manufacturers and sellers and publications like Black Belt magazine. And this became very established. When I was a kid in the 1980s, you know, many of us in the UK remember when Ninja Turtles came along, or Hero Turtles as they had to be called in the UK because everyone had ninja panic in 1988, and lots of ninja weapons were banned. You know, throwing stars were banned, foot claws, all of these kind of, you know, exotic, very dangerous Japanese weapons, which in fact for the most part are more harmless than your typical kitchen knife. They were all banned, and this still continues to this day, but that's a political matter for outside the scope of this video. Now, finally, I want to sum up. Was there some possible historical inspiration for ninja swords or ninja toe beyond the fact that they're fundamentally like a wakizashi? And I suspect that you know, most ninja, like most other soldiers at the time, if they had to use a sword, if they had to wear or carry a sword, they would have gone for the wakizashi. So most ninjas would have had a wakizashi. Probably not a longer sword, given that their status and the kind of role that they played. More likely to have a wakizashi, which for most of Japanese feudal history was the standard soldier's sidearm. Okay, so if you were a spearman, if you were a musketeer, most of the time a wakizashi would be the most common. That's why in the antique collecting world, the most common type of Japanese sword to find is a wakizashi. Okay, right. There is some potential inspiration for these. So there are earlier Chinese swords, okay, which found their way into Japanese temples. And in fact, some of the best surviving, including the one that this is a replica of, some of the best surviving early Chinese swords are actually found in Japan because they were preserved in temples. Now, you have to understand that obviously when Japan started out, it was heavily connected to China, and the earliest Japanese swords that we know of were essentially Chinese in design. Not to say they were necessarily all Chinese made, although a lot of them probably were. But anyway, a lot of Chinese swords ended up in Japanese temples and preserved there. And many of these have straight blades with a angled tip single-edged, so the kind of precursor to later Japanese swords. And the blades of these are fundamentally quite similar to ninjato, or historical, so supposedly, ninja swords. So it is possible that at some point in history, these swords became associated, the shokuta became associated somehow with the ninja for some reason. And it's completely lost to the mists of time how that might be the case. It could simply be that in the middle of the 20th century, where movies started to be made featuring ninjas as characters, or in fact theatre, maybe in the Edo period, and let's say the 1800s, started to feature ninjas, it's possible that they wanted a type of sword that looked different, so they looked different to the samurai, and so they went back to an older style of Japanese blade, or in fact Chinese designed Japanese sword found in temples and so on and so forth, and decided to use that. That's one of the only possible real historically plausible answers I can think of. I have seen some explanations from practitioners of ninjutsu as to why the ninja sword might be straight and why it might be shaped the way it is, and most of those don't really hold water with me. One final bit of historical, perhaps, inspiration for the Japanese ninja sword is in the 19th century, particularly in the Meiji period, okay, so right towards the end of the 19th century, police were using straight-bladed swords. And you can see a good video about this on Let's Ask Shogo's channel. The police were using quite straight-bladed swords, and again, it's possible that in that period, for some reason, people started to associate these swords with practitioners of ninjutsu, and maybe there's a complex relationship there. Maybe the use of Bujinkan, maybe in Bujinkan schools, because there was some association perhaps with police training. Perhaps these straight swords were adopted from the police and then came to be thought of as ninja swords. I don't know. It's possible, and it's worth researching and examining. And you might ask why police use straight swords. Well, I refer you to Shogo's video, which is a very good video. And essentially it's because, or at least it seems to be partly because, Kendo shinai are straight, and the police were some of the foremost practitioners of Kendo, so when they came to be armed with swords, they chose straight swords rather than curved swords. That's one possible explanation. Anyway, I hope this has been thoughtful and thought-provoking, and kind of made you look at this from another direction. Maybe you've got information you could throw into this that I'm not aware of, but I've tried to give a brief summary of everything that I'm aware of and everything I've read. Fundamentally, I think that ninja, let's say in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, were almost certainly, if they used a sword, would have used a wakizashi. The straight ninja toe with a square guard is basically, as far as I can tell, an invention of the mid-20th century and is basically fantasy. It's possible that it has an inspiration in either police swords or indeed swords of the Kanbun era, which tend to be quite straight as well, incidentally, which is 17th century. So it's possible it has some historical inspiration, but fundamentally seems to be a product of film and movies and TV and theatre. And finally, to finish off, a lot of what you find online now, as of the last decade, labelled as ninja swords, are nothing like either ninja toe or wakizashi. They're like some modern invention, and really more similar to what we would term a zombie knife in the UK currently. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. Thanks a lot to our sponsors for this video as well, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.